good Erev Shabbos. My father-in-law of blessed memory imparted to us a number of stories and even a few good jokes from the early days of Israel. He came to Europe before the state was established, and he was there as a young man, and he remembered many of the scenes and details of those days and some of the jokes that went with them. Even in those days, it seemed that policing was looked down upon with a certain measure of disdain, which reminds me, unfortunately, of our times. So he told a story about police one day on their rounds in Tel Aviv, and they came across a horse that had collapsed and died there on the street corner. They knew that their duty was to file a report, so one officer took out his notebook, starts writing. The sub-joke here is that the policemen used to go out in pairs because one would know how to write and one would know how to read. So he takes out his notebook and he starts to writing his report, composing his report there. He writes, horse found dead at the corner of Allenby and, looks up at the street sign, Chernichovsky. So he's trying to write, starts out writing Chernichovsky, has 7 mistakes, and he's erasing and scratching out and trying to write it again. His partner's looking over his shoulder. And finally, they take a look at each other. They know what needs to be done. So together they grab the horse and they schlep this horse. They drag the dead horse down the street, down Allenby, to the next corner where it runs into Hess. Hess has only 2 letters in Hebrew, you see, so it's a little bit easier to write in a report than Chernichovsky. It's a little bit of good old-fashioned Chelm story, transported to early days of Tel Aviv. If you read a little bit more deeply into the joke, it doesn't go to any great lengths to make the policemen look too conscientious. They don't even realize that they're making their own job harder in their effort to make it easier. We can say, unfortunately, that in our days, disdain for the police is still a widespread sentiment. In fact, frustration with the way policing takes place in America lately, this spring, this summer, boiled over into a political slogan of defund the police. And the extent to which a little of foolishness from now and again sneaks over the border from America, the slogan even made it here to Toronto. Can't even really call it a movement. It's really more something to put on your protest sign as you march, rather than an actual live idea. Before talking about the idea of policing across the ages, particularly from our Parsha, I'll name my white privilege, as it's become customary to do. I grew up in the white suburbs of America with very little interaction with police. The one thing that sticks out in my mind is that we had an assembly in elementary school once a year, and an officer from the county sheriff would come and talk to us together with his colleague, Harvey the talking motorcycle, who would beep and honk and flash his siren light and all that to keep us entertained while the policeman explained bicycle and road safety to all the kids. I also got stopped by a city policeman once and was given a ticket, not for talking on a cell phone, which was not yet illegal in New Jersey at that time, but because while I was talking on the phone and trying to drive, I got a little distracted and I mistakenly drove into the wrong lane. I was in the oncoming lane. I thought it was a one-way street. And that was worth a ticket. Plus, my license was from out of state, and I got a warning that if I was going to be here for any length of time, I was supposed to go and get a local license. Also probably part of the white privilege story. The other disclaimer I have to make is that my perception is tinted by my uncle, many of you have met him when he was here for the bar mitzvahs, a very modest and quiet man who started out as a patrolman in the Newton, Massachusetts police, which is 2 towns out of Boston, and he eventually became chief of police there until he retired a few years back. Well, this summer his replacement retired suddenly when all the protests started unfolding, and Uncle Howard was called back to duty as interim chief. I've been talking to him about policing for decades and hearing stories from the front lines. My one other major experience with policing comes from being a dorm counselor on a university campus. We worked very closely as dorm counselors with the university police force, who were all deputy Boston City Police. And our main goals were keeping people safe, walking the city streets at night around Kenmore Square and Fenway Park and all that, and breaking up the parties when the students would bring pot or beer kegs into the dorms. I'm sure after this talk I'll hear from all of you about your encounters with police at other places and other times. Suffice it to say that the Torah is a great recognizer and acknowledger of human nature and the nature of society, And when the Torah advises us how to set up a society, it's with good reason and knowledge of human nature, arguably more perceptive than our impressionistic and changing views. So in short, the Torah tells us with both good reason and the voice of eternity across the ages. At the very beginning of this week's Sedra, it says, Shoftim v'shotrim titen lecha b'chol sha'arecha. You should appoint judges and officers of the law, police, at all your city gates. Asher Hashem Elokecha naisen lecha l'shvatecha, that God gives you for all your tribes. Remember, it's the Jewish people preparing to enter into the land of Israel, and Moshe giving us all the instructions we'll need. And it concludes, V'shavtu es ha'am mishpat tzedek. These officials should judge the people with righteous judgment. Now, on the face of it, this does not jive with the idea of defund the police. The Torah is telling us that it's an essential feature of ordered society. In fact, much of Parsha Shoftim here has to do with articulating a court system of higher and lower courts, the tangible and intangible responsibility of civic leaders to set an example of moral and decent and responsible behavior, because, as the Sforno writes, commenting on these verses, the conduct of the leaders has a powerful influence on people, for good or for the opposite. You see where we might go with that conversation. Looking at it technically, the strict letter of the law, is the Torah saying that America and Canada must have police and a judicial and court system and constables and all the rest? Well, not exactly, but the more complete answer is yes. Maimonides, Rambam, writes in his Code of Law, Mishnah Torah, that these laws in our parsha that we're reading this week are talking about a Jewish society in the Jewish land, meaning that the judges and bailiffs and officers and inspectors and watchmen and police that the Torah is instructing us to appoint and station throughout society, this all refers specifically to when there is Jewish sovereignty, and we're talking about in the Jewish land. The mishpat tzedek, the righteous judgment that they are to uphold as part of their responsibility, is the Torah's justice, with the Beit Din, the rabbinic court, compensation, witnesses, and justice the way the Torah commands it. We do not wish to see Canada or America become a Jewish theocracy. That's certainly not our goal. It's an interesting and open question, the extent to which we wish to see Israel itself become a Jewish theocracy at all, and what that means. If the ideal would be to have religious courts only, when the courts also rest on a system of jurisprudence that's very well articulated and documented over millennia, not just decades or centuries. The longer answer, which is in the affirmative actually, is that the Talmud, the Tosefta and Sanhedrin, talks about 7 laws that the Talmud expects of all humankind, all children of Noah. So they're called the 7 Noahide laws. There are 6 prohibitions, things that we don't want to see anybody doing, Jewish or not Jewish: idolatry, blasphemy, immorality, murder, theft, and cruelty to animals. And there's one obligation: to establish courts of law and a justice system. The one positive commandment that Judaism wishes upon, expects really, to see from all humankind that everyone should follow, is that they should build a just society through legal institutions. So in that sense, Torah does want Canada and America, and for that matter Russia and Venezuela and Uganda and all the rest, to have responsible courts of law and police systems and equitable and fair civil societies. Not necessarily that every country should be run by Torah law. That probably will not be a very popular seller in Saudi Arabia. But the system that is there should be fair and incorruptible, as far as that's possible, and reliable and transparent. Now you know how far we have to go to implement the full Jewish vision for humankind. So back to this idea of defunding the police that we've been hearing about. Maimonides writes these words in his Guide for the Perplexed, Moreh Nevuchim. He says, quote, "If sinners and robbers are not punished, injury would not be prevented at all, and persons scheming evil would not become rarer." Now listen to this carefully. They are wrong who suppose that it would be an act of mercy to abandon the laws of compensation for injuries. On the contrary, it would be perfect cruelty and injury to the social state of the country. It's an act of mercy that God commanded judges and officers, Shoftim v'shotrim, our parsha this week, shall you appoint in all your gates. That's the end of the Rambam's words. So it's not as if defund the police was invented this summer. In Rambam's time already, people had this wonderful idea. What do we need police for? Let's all just rely. We'll all do our best, okay? We'll take care of each other. Rambam says pretty clearly, you're making a mistake. Your heart may be in the right place, but your head, not so much. There's always a number of people who will take unfair advantage of the situation for their own benefit, and we need courts and officers and constables to keep that in check. Of course, it's a much larger conversation to be had about when the scofflaws themselves manage to attain office, but that's for later. For now, I think we have to acknowledge that if indeed we see the police in our society as a force for safety and order, it seems clear that not everybody shares that view. Those who grew up witnessing policing in South Africa probably have a different story to tell as well, and I'm all ears. It would be enlightening and fascinating to hear. Based on our parsha, the Torah does not countenance eliminating the police, and it looks at that idea as perhaps foolishly optimistic. What is needed is to focus on the second part of the verse, V'shaftu es ha'am mishpat tzedek. Not enough to put the police in place. We have to make sure that they judge the people with righteous judgment. You get what you incentivize, a wise man once told me. And if police are incentivized simply to arrest, detain, and harass, particularly the more marginal members of our society, by class or by color or however, that is not mishpat tzedek. Maybe it is time for an overhaul, a reckoning of what safety and security for all would look like in our society. And the police cannot be the only guarantors of that. It takes an effort across society, including teachers, parents, clergy, politicians, and citizens ourselves, to make civil society a working and beneficial one for everyone. Now, along these notions of self-policing and self-regulating, the most common drasha for this time of year on these words, because they come, as they always do, on the first Shabbos of the month of Elul, we talk about the individual person placing judges and guards at our own personal gates. Titen lecha, it says in the singular. Each and every person should put bailiffs, policemen, watchmen at our own personal gates. What are those? Our mouths, our eyes, our ears, to judge very carefully everything that's coming in and everything that's going out. We are affected by, we're changed by, we're shaped by what we see and what we hear in front of us, whether it's in person or on television or internet or whatever the venue is. If we screen out and block our access to crass and low culture and thinking, we can preserve our high ideals and maybe, very importantly, our capacity to be shocked. One of the outstanding features in our world today, and not in the most complimentary way, is that it takes an awful lot to shock people. What used to be culturally taboo is now part of advertising and media all around us. It takes much more to screen it out. And we have to have those guardians at our eyes and our ears working that much harder to surround us with messages and messaging of higher ideals, higher morality, and more appeal to our intellects and to our souls, not less. That way we can affect our mouths and the words that come out of them and the values that those words express. Now that we're in the month of Elul, just less than a month away from Rosh Hashanah, it's particularly important. It's a particularly auspicious time to re-examine those guardians, maybe make adjustments a little bit and appoint some new officers if that's necessary. We take stock of ourselves and where we are and figure out where we want to be and what it will take to get us there. The verse that teaches about a city of refuge, which is a topic of this week's parsha also. In Aliyad v'samti lecha. It starts with the letters Aleph Lamed Vav Lamed, which spells Elul, suggesting that this month can be a refuge for us. We seek God when He is very close to us and particularly approachable to us, especially at this time of year. As we put more effort into remaking ourselves in Elul in preparation for Tishrei, that's the best way to transform the world, by starting right here, right now, with my own self. Shabbat Shalom, Shana Tova.